Good evening, my friend, tonight, wherever you happen to be, whether you're stretched out beneath a blanket, sitting in a quiet room, or simply looking for a story to drift through before sleep, I'm glad you're here. And before we begin our journey, if you enjoy these long explorations into the strange corners of history, you might consider subscribing. You can also leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always find it fascinating that while one person is listening in the middle of a rainy afternoon, another is listening long after midnight, and somehow we all end up wandering through the same story together. Now, tonight's story begins with something so ordinary that most of us barely notice it. A seed, not a sword, not a king, not a great battle, not some legendary invention that changed the world overnight. Just a seed, small enough to disappear into the palm of your hand, small enough to be carried in a pocket without a second thought. Yet hidden inside that tiny object is one of the strangest stories humanity has ever lived through. Because there is an uncomfortable possibility, a possibility that historians still argue about. What if one of the greatest achievements in human history was also one of the most expensive mistakes we ever made? What if the invention that eventually gave us cities, kingdoms, writing, science, technology, and the modern world also trapped billions of people inside a lifestyle they never would have chosen willingly? And perhaps the strangest part of all is that nobody planned it. 20,000 years ago, nobody was trying to create civilization. Nobody sat down beside a fire and announced a grand vision for the future. Nobody said, "Let's build nations. Let's create taxes. Let's invent landlords. Let's spend most of our lives working. Let's create armies. Let's create social classes. Let's create paperwork. Let's make people argue about property lines for the next 10,000 years." None of that existed. The people living 20,000 years ago were occupied with much simpler concerns. Would there be enough food tomorrow? Would the weather change? Would the animals return? Would the children survive the winter? Would the river still be flowing next season? Simple questions. But simple questions often create complicated futures. The popular image of prehistoric life is usually a gloomy one. Many people imagine that our ancestors spent every waking moment desperately searching for food, constantly starving, constantly suffering, constantly on the edge of disaster. Reality appears to have been much more complicated than that. Life was certainly difficult. Nobody is pretending otherwise. There were injuries. There were illnesses. There were dangerous animals. There were harsh winters. There were droughts. There were accidents. There were countless ways for things to go wrong. But there was also something else. Something modern people rarely think about. Freedom. Not freedom in the political sense. Not freedom of speech. Not freedom protected by laws. A different kind of freedom. The freedom that comes from mobility. The freedom to leave. If resources disappeared in one area, people moved. If the seasons changed, people moved. If conflict emerged, people moved. If the land stopped providing what they needed, people moved. Movement was not a sign of weakness. It was a survival strategy. And for tens of thousands of years, it worked remarkably well. Imagine waking up 20,000 years ago. The first thing you might notice would be the cold. Not the kind of cold controlled by thermostats. Not the kind of cold solved by turning up the heat. Real cold. The cold that touches your face before you've fully opened your eyes. The cold carried by morning air moving across open land. The kind of cold that reminds you immediately that nature is not interested in your comfort. You would smell smoke from last night's fire. You would hear birds before seeing them. You would hear wind moving through grasses. You would hear distant water. And beyond those sounds, something unfamiliar to modern ears. Space. A vast amount of space. No highways, no engines, no distant traffic, no electrical hum, no airplanes crossing overhead, no glowing cities beyond the horizon. Just landscape, stretching outward in every direction. A world that felt larger because humans occupied so little of it. At night, the darkness would have been even more extraordinary. Today, most people have never truly seen darkness. There is usually some light somewhere. A street lamp, a building, a passing car, a distant town. 20,000 years ago, darkness arrived differently. When the sun disappeared, the world vanished with it. The stars emerged in impossible numbers, thousands upon thousands. The sky becoming crowded, while the earth beneath it grew almost invisible. And beneath that enormous sky lived small groups of humans who knew their environments with astonishing precision. They knew where edible roots could be found. They knew which berries were safe. They knew animal migration routes. They knew where water remained during dry seasons. They knew how to read tracks. They knew how to predict weather from subtle signs that most modern people would never notice. Their knowledge was not written down. It existed in memory, in stories, in habits, in observation, in experience accumulated across generations. A child born into such a world did not learn from books. The landscape itself became the classroom. Every hill taught something. Every river taught something. Every season taught something. And because survival depended on paying attention, people became extraordinarily good at noticing details. A broken branch, an unfamiliar footprint, the smell of rain before rain arrived, the sudden silence of birds, the distant movement of animals. Nothing was unimportant, because anything might matter. And perhaps that is one reason the first steps toward farming happened so slowly. The people who eventually changed human history were not inventors in the modern sense. They were observers, people who noticed patterns, people who noticed that certain plants tended to appear in certain places, people who noticed that seeds dropped near camps sometimes grew, people who noticed that useful grasses often returned year after year. At first, these observations meant very little. After all, humans had been interacting with plants for countless generations. Nobody suddenly discovered seeds. Nobody suddenly discovered growth. Plants had always existed. The real change was far more subtle. The change happened when people began wondering whether nature could become slightly more predictable. Not completely predictable, just a little. Just enough to reduce uncertainty. Just enough to create a small advantage. And human beings have always been vulnerable to small advantages. That is one of the most consistent patterns in history. We rarely transform our lives because of enormous decisions. We transform our lives because of tiny conveniences. A shortcut, a tool, a habit, a solution to a temporary problem. Something that seems helpful today, something that appears harmless, something that nobody expects to become permanent. Imagine a group returning repeatedly to the same valley because wild grain grows there in abundance. Each year they arrive. Each year they harvest. Each year they stay a little longer. The place becomes familiar, comfortable, predictable. Children grow up recognizing the landscape. Paths become known. Water sources become known. shelter locations become known. And gradually, the idea of staying begins to feel less strange. Not forever, just a little longer. Human history is full of dangerous phrases. One of the most dangerous may be, just a little longer. A few extra weeks. A few extra months. One more season. Nothing dramatic. Nothing revolutionary. No trumpets announcing the birth of civilization. Only small decisions. The kind people barely notice while making them. And somewhere along the way, another idea begins to appear. An idea that sounds wonderfully sensible. What if we save some food? Not all of it. Just a little extra. Just in case. Just in case the weather changes. Just in case hunting becomes difficult. Just in case next season is worse than this one. And honestly, it is difficult to argue against such logic, even today. Most people understand the appeal immediately. Preparation feels responsible. Preparation feels intelligent. Preparation feels safe. But preparation has a hidden side. Because the moment you store food, your relationship with the future changes. For most of human existence, food was largely a present tense problem. You found it. You gathered it. You hunted it. You ate it. Tomorrow would be dealt with tomorrow. Stored food changes everything. Suddenly, tomorrow is sitting beside you. Visible, countable, measurable. You can look at it. You can estimate how long it might last. You can imagine futures that have not happened yet. And strangely, that creates a new kind of anxiety. A person with no stored grain worries about finding food. A person with stored grain worries about losing it. What if it gets wet? What if animals find it? What if insects get inside? What if another group steals it? What if someone takes more than their share? What if winter lasts longer than expected? What if the harvest next year fails? What if? What if? What if? And without realizing it, humans begin spending more time thinking about the future than ever before, not dreaming about it, managing it, protecting it, calculating it. Because a pile of grain is never just food. It is security. It is risk. It is hope. It is fear. It is tomorrow sitting quietly in front of you. And although nobody could possibly know it yet, that little pile of stored grain is the beginning of a story that will eventually create cities, kings, taxes, armies, laws, wealth, poverty, and a world so different from the one around them that they would scarcely recognize it. The strange thing is that none of it begins with ambition. It begins with caution. It begins with ordinary people trying to solve ordinary problems. And like so many changes in human history, the solution would eventually become something far larger than the problem it was meant to fix. The strange thing about traps is that the best ones rarely look like traps at all. A trap that looks dangerous is easy to avoid. A trap that looks useful can survive for generations. And somewhere, across many different valleys, riverbanks, grasslands, and seasonal camps, human beings began building something that felt useful. Not farming, not yet. That comes later. First came familiarity. A place that had once been visited became a place that was expected. A place that was expected slowly became a place that was depended upon. And dependence has a curious way of changing how people think. Imagine returning to the same location year after year. The first year, it is simply a fortunate place. The second year, it is a good place. The third year, it begins to feel reliable. The 5th year, it starts to feel like yours. Not officially, not legally. Nothing has been written down. No boundary markers exist. No deeds. No contracts. No maps. And yet something has already changed. Humans have always been extremely good at forming emotional attachments, not only to people, to places, to routines, to expectations. A valley where food appears every year stops being merely a valley. It becomes part of your memory, part of your identity, part of your future. Children begin recognizing familiar trees, familiar hills, familiar streams. They know where the fish are found. They know where certain plants grow. They know where grandparents once sat beside evening fires. And without anyone planning it, the landscape begins accumulating history. History is surprisingly heavy. It makes leaving more difficult. Not impossible, just a little harder than before. And once again, history moves forward through tiny changes rather than dramatic ones. People stay a little longer. They build slightly better shelters. Why rebuild everything from scratch every season? Why not improve what already exists? A stronger roof, a thicker wall, a storage pit, a place for tools, a place for drying food, a place for sleeping, a place that can wait for your return. The logic is flawless. The logic is always flawless. History's most powerful transformations usually begin with ideas that make perfect sense. Nobody wakes up intending to create dependency. Dependency emerges from convenience. A shelter saves effort. A storage pit saves effort. A familiar camp saves effort. A predictable food source saves effort. Each improvement appears reasonable. Each improvement solves a real problem. And gradually, an invisible exchange takes place. A little flexibility is traded for a little security, then a little more, then a little more. The exchange is so gradual that almost nobody notices it happening. If someone had asked a family during this period whether they were giving up freedom, they probably would have laughed. Freedom? No. They were simply making life easier. They were reducing uncertainty. They were preparing for difficult seasons. They were being practical. Human beings love practical decisions. The difficulty is that practical decisions sometimes create consequences nobody intended. Because once food is stored, somebody must watch it. And that sounds like a small problem until you think about it. For most of human history, food had legs. Food moved. Animals moved. Fish moved. People moved. But stored grain stays exactly where it is. And anything that stays in one place becomes vulnerable. Suddenly, a new question appears. Who protects the food? At first, perhaps everyone does. The group watches together. The responsibility is shared. Simple, reasonable. But then another question appears. Who decides how much food is removed? Again, perhaps everyone decides together at first. Most systems begin with trust. Trust works beautifully when conditions are good. The challenge arrives when conditions are bad. Imagine a difficult season. Rain arrives late. Game becomes scarce. Children are hungry. Food reserves seem smaller than expected. People become nervous. And nervous people begin counting. How much remains? Who took extra? Who deserves more? Who deserves less? Questions that barely mattered before suddenly become important, because stored food transforms survival into mathematics. And mathematics has a way of creating arguments. A hunter who returns empty-handed may feel disappointed. A community looking at a dwindling food supply feels something different. The future itself begins shrinking. Every handful removed changes tomorrow. Every meal becomes connected to calculations. Every decision has consequences that stretch forward into months that have not yet arrived. And so people begin planning further ahead, further and further, until eventually entire lives become organized around futures that do not yet exist. A remarkable achievement, and a remarkably exhausting one. The human brain is extremely good at imagining problems. Give it enough time and enough uncertainty, and it will create an endless supply. Perhaps that is why farming eventually appealed to so many communities, not because it promised comfort, because it promised predictability. Those are not the same thing. Predictability often feels safer than freedom, even when it isn't. Especially when it isn't. If a hunter-gatherer wakes up and discovers that one food source has failed, there may be alternatives. Different plants, different animals, different territories, different opportunities. Movement remains possible. For people becoming increasingly tied to specific locations, options begin narrowing. A failed harvest cannot simply be replaced overnight. A field represents months of effort, months of hope, months of planning. When something goes wrong, the consequences are larger. But those consequences are not obvious yet. For now, people are enjoying the benefits. Food can be stored. Children can be raised in more stable environments. Useful tools can accumulate. Knowledge about specific locations deepens. Life appears increasingly organized, increasingly secure, increasingly efficient. And efficiency has its own kind of beauty. Modern people understand this instinctively. Whenever a new technology promises convenience, we rarely ask what we might be giving up. We focus on what we gain: time, comfort, reliability, predictability. Our ancestors were no different. Except the technology transforming their lives was not a machine. It was an idea. The idea that nature could be encouraged, guided, managed, perhaps even improved. And that idea began with observations so ordinary they would have seemed almost unimportant. Someone notices that seeds dropped near camp seem to grow. Someone notices that disturbed ground produces useful plants. Someone notices that certain grasses appear where people have spent time. At first, these observations mean very little. Interesting, perhaps useful, but hardly revolutionary. Yet human beings possess a remarkable talent. When we discover patterns, we immediately begin wondering whether those patterns can be repeated. And repeated patterns eventually become habits. Habits become traditions. Traditions become systems. Systems become worlds. The first person who deliberately scattered seeds may not have considered themselves an inventor. They may have simply been experimenting, trying something, seeing what happened. The history of humanity is filled with people trying things. Most experiments disappear. A few survive. The surviving ones reshape everything. And so somewhere in the deep past, long before cities, long before kings, long before writing, long before taxes and armies and monuments, a quiet realization began spreading through different communities. Maybe food did not always have to be found. Maybe some food could be encouraged to appear. Not created, not controlled, simply encouraged. A modest idea, a humble idea, the sort of idea that would never seem capable of changing the future of the entire species. Yet hidden inside that idea was a dangerous possibility, because once humans discover a way to influence nature, they almost never stop there. They always want a little more control, a little more certainty, a little more predictability, a little more safety. And the story of farming, in many ways, is the story of what happened when that desire slowly became stronger than the desire to remain free. For now, nobody can see where the path leads. They only see the next season, the next harvest, the next winter, the next problem to solve. And perhaps that is exactly why the path is so easy to follow. The first field probably did not look very impressive. That may be the most important thing to remember. When modern people imagine the beginning of agriculture, they often picture a dramatic moment, a visionary figure standing in a vast field, a breakthrough, an invention, a turning point. History is rarely so cooperative. Most likely, nobody realized they were standing at the beginning of anything. The first cultivated patches of land may have looked almost accidental, a little area where useful plants seemed to grow more reliably, a place that required a bit of attention, a bit of clearing, a bit of patience. Nothing extraordinary, at least not yet. And that is often how enormous changes arrive. Not with a roar, with a shrug, with people saying things like, "Well, that seemed to work." Then trying it again. Imagine waking before sunrise. The air is cool, the ground is damp, mist hangs low over the landscape. You walk toward a place that now feels familiar. Not because your ancestors have lived there forever, but because you've returned enough times that it feels predictable, and predictability is becoming increasingly valuable. You arrive at the small patch of land. Tiny green shoots are emerging. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would impress anyone. Yet those little plants contain something powerful. Not food, not yet. Expectation. Expectation may be one of the most dangerous forces in human history. Once you expect something, your behavior changes. Once you depend on something, your life changes. A hunter can wake each morning asking what the world might provide. A farmer eventually wakes asking whether the world will deliver what has already been promised. Those are very different questions. One contains possibility. The other contains anxiety. At first, the work seems manageable. Remove a few unwanted plants. Protect the young shoots. Watch the weather. Return regularly. Simple. But the strange thing about growing food is that food begins demanding your attention long before it becomes edible. The plants do not care if you are tired. They do not care if a child is sick. They do not care if you would rather spend the day somewhere else. They do not negotiate. They do not compromise. They simply continue growing according to their own schedule. And gradually, human schedules begin adapting to theirs, a subtle shift, easy to miss, but profound. For countless generations, humans had followed nature. Now they were beginning to organize their lives around specific pieces of it. A field does not allow complete flexibility. A field expects you to return again and again and again. Miss the right moment, and opportunities disappear. Miss the rains, miss the planting season, miss the harvest, and months of effort can vanish. For perhaps the first time on a large scale, people were investing enormous amounts of labor into futures they could not guarantee. The field became a promise. The problem was that promises can be broken, not by people, by weather, by insects, by disease, by animals, by simple bad luck. The field could betray you without intending to. And that uncertainty produced a very specific kind of tension. A tension familiar to anyone who has ever waited for important news. Anyone who has ever watched a storm approach. Anyone who has ever hoped that circumstances beyond their control would somehow cooperate. Imagine spending months tending a crop, every day invested, every day committed, every day carrying the silent expectation that all of this effort will eventually become food. Then imagine dark clouds arriving at the wrong time or not arriving at all. Imagine standing at the edge of a field and realizing that your future now depends on events happening far beyond your influence. The feeling must have been deeply unsettling, because there is something psychologically comforting about immediate action. If food is scarce, you hunt. If water is needed, you search. If danger appears, you react. Agriculture introduced a new experience. Waiting. Waiting became work. Waiting became responsibility. Waiting became survival. And humans are not naturally comfortable with waiting. We prefer action. We prefer movement. We prefer solutions that happen now. The field offered solutions later, much later. Perhaps that is why early farming communities often seem to have doubled down whenever problems appeared. A failed harvest did not necessarily encourage abandonment. Quite often, it encouraged greater effort, more planting, more labor, more preparation, more storage, more attempts to gain control over uncertainty. This is another pattern that appears throughout history. The solution to one problem creates another. The solution to that problem creates another. And eventually people find themselves maintaining systems so complicated that nobody remembers how simple things once were. The first farmers probably never intended to work more, yet many eventually did. Not because they were foolish, not because they made obvious mistakes, but because farming rewards persistence. If one harvest is disappointing, perhaps the next will be better. If one field struggles, perhaps another field will succeed. If one season fails, perhaps next year will bring abundance. Hope becomes part of the system. Hope keeps people investing effort. Hope keeps people returning. Hope keeps people planting. And hope can be surprisingly difficult to abandon, especially after you've already invested so much. A hunter-gatherer can leave a failing area. A farmer often cannot leave so easily. The field represents labor already spent, time already spent, dreams already spent. Leaving means accepting loss. Human beings have never enjoyed accepting loss. We would often rather work harder, stay longer, try again, one more season, one more year, one more harvest, and slowly, almost invisibly, the relationship between people and food begins reversing. For most of human history, humans pursued food. Now food begins directing humans. The crops determine schedules. The crops determine movement. The crops determine priorities. The crops determine when labor happens. The crops determine when risk is taken. The crops become silent masters, not cruel masters, not intentional masters, simply demanding ones. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. Agriculture is usually described as humanity gaining control over nature. Yet from another perspective, nature gained a remarkable degree of control over humanity. Millions of people would eventually organize entire lives around the needs of a handful of domesticated plants: wheat, rice, barley, millet, corn. Tiny biological organisms quietly reshaping civilizations. If that sounds absurd, it is because it is. History often becomes strange when viewed from the right angle. Imagine explaining modern civilization to a traveler from 20,000 years ago. You would describe enormous cities, governments, universities, airports, skyscrapers, global trade, computers, spacecraft, and eventually, if you kept tracing the chain backward, you would arrive at an unexpected conclusion. A large part of it happened because humans became extraordinarily devoted to certain grasses. The traveller might reasonably wonder whether you were joking, and honestly, it does sound a little ridiculous. Yet here we are, because once farming begins working reasonably well, another change begins. A change that may have altered human society more profoundly than almost anything else. People begin having more children, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The reason is surprisingly practical. A mobile life imposes limits. Carrying one child is difficult. Carrying two very young children is much more difficult. Carrying three can become nearly impossible. Movement naturally slows population growth. Settled life changes the equation. Children no longer need to travel long distances as frequently. Food can sometimes be stored. Homes become more permanent. The landscape becomes more predictable. And little by little, families begin growing. At first, this seems like wonderful news. More children, more life, more future, more hands to help, more people to support one another. But every advantage arrives carrying a shadow. More children require more food. More food requires more fields. More fields require more labor. More labor encourages larger families. Larger families require even more food. The cycle begins quietly, then strengthens, then becomes difficult to escape. A strange machine has started operating. A machine built from hope, necessity, and survival. A machine that grows stronger with every generation. And almost nobody notices it happening, because each step feels reasonable when viewed on its own. That is the true genius of history. The biggest changes rarely feel big while they are happening. They feel normal. They feel practical. They feel temporary. And by the time people realize the world has changed, the old world is often already gone. As the seasons continue passing, as more fields appear, as more food is stored, as more children are born, a new question begins, quietly emerging. A question that would eventually shape kingdoms, empires, and entire civilizations. Who owns all of this? Not tomorrow, not yet, but soon, very soon. For a very long time, ownership had been a surprisingly blurry idea. Not non-existent, just blurry. A person might own a tool, a spear, a knife, a necklace, a carefully crafted object that clearly belonged to someone. But land was different. Land was enormous. Land was shared. Land was visited. Land was remembered. Yet it was rarely controlled in the way later civilizations would understand. A river did not belong to a person. A valley did not belong to a person. A forest did not belong to a person. At least, not in the way a modern house belongs to its owner. The landscape was something people lived within, not something they possessed. But farming slowly introduced a problem. Fields require labor, lots of labor, hours, days, months, entire seasons. And human beings tend to become protective of things they have invested effort into. This is still true today. A person who spends 10 minutes assembling a chair may feel mildly attached to it. A person who spends 6 months building a house feels something much stronger. Effort creates attachment. Attachment creates claims. Claims create arguments. The sequence appears again and again throughout history. A family clears a patch of land. They remove stones, cut brush, prepare soil, plant seeds, protect the crops, wait through uncertainty. Then, eventually, someone else arrives. Perhaps another family, perhaps visitors, perhaps people who have used the same area for generations. And suddenly, an awkward question appears. Who has the right to use this land? Nobody enjoys asking such questions. Even fewer people enjoy answering them. Because once ownership enters a conversation, relationships change. A place that once felt open begins feeling restricted. A place that once welcomed movement begins establishing boundaries, not fences yet, not walls, not official borders, something much older. An idea and ideas can be harder than stone. Perhaps someone points toward a field and says, "We planted that." A perfectly reasonable statement, difficult to argue with, but hidden inside those three words is a revolutionary concept. We planted that. Not nature, not everyone, we. The statement creates an inside and an outside. People who belong, people who do not, people who have rights, people who do not. The change is subtle, but enormous. Because once food production becomes connected to specific groups, questions of fairness become far more complicated. Who receives the harvest? Who helps create it? Who decides distribution? Who stores it? Who protects it? Who inherits it? And perhaps most importantly, who is excluded from it? For tens of thousands of years, survival had often depended upon cooperation. Now cooperation remained important, but competition was quietly growing beside it. Stored food has a strange effect on human relationships. You can see it, you can count it, you can compare it. And human beings have always compared things. Perhaps one family stores more grain than another. Perhaps one field performs better. Perhaps one harvest is unusually successful. At first, these differences may seem minor, temporary, nothing worth worrying about. But differences have a habit of accumulating. One successful harvest becomes two, two become five, five become 20, and gradually, some families begin possessing larger reserves than others. Not necessarily because they are smarter, not necessarily because they are harder working. Sometimes simply because they were luckier. Weather favored them. Their soil was better. Their location was better. Disease avoided them. Accidents avoided them. History often gives rewards without asking whether they are deserved. And once unequal outcomes appear, human beings immediately begin searching for explanations. Perhaps successful families are blessed. Perhaps they are wiser. Perhaps their ancestors were special. Perhaps the gods favor them. Perhaps they simply work harder. People invent stories to explain differences. We always have. The stories are often more comfortable than randomness. Randomness is unsettling. Randomness suggests that misfortune could happen to anyone. Most people prefer a universe that feels ordered, even if that order exists mostly inside their imagination. As grain stores grow larger, another fascinating thing begins happening. The future becomes visible, not for everyone. For some, a family with substantial food reserves can imagine next year more confidently. Perhaps even the year after. They can survive difficulties more easily, recover from mistakes more easily, take risks more easily. Security begins producing more security. Meanwhile, insecurity produces more insecurity. A poor harvest becomes devastating if reserves are already low. One setback leads to another, and suddenly, the gap between families starts widening. Nobody planned it. Nobody designed it. It emerges naturally from the system itself. That may be one of the most unsettling aspects of agriculture. Many of its consequences were not created by villains. They emerged from ordinary people, solving ordinary problems. The result, however, could still be dramatic. Imagine two neighboring households. One has plenty. One does not. A difficult winter arrives. Food grows scarce. Children are hungry. The situation becomes uncomfortable, then desperate, then dangerous. What happens next? Perhaps food is shared. Perhaps cooperation prevails. Human beings are capable of extraordinary generosity, but perhaps food is loaned instead. A temporary arrangement, perfectly reasonable. Take some grain now. Return some grain later. Again, the logic seems harmless, helpful even. Yet debt often begins as kindness. The first debts in history probably did not feel like oppression. They felt like assistance, a favor, a lifeline, a practical solution. Only later do such arrangements become systems. And systems have a tendency to outlive the circumstances that created them. One season passes, then another. The debt remains. A family owes grain, perhaps labor, perhaps access to future harvests, perhaps something else. Gradually, relationships become more complicated, less equal, less flexible. The language may not exist yet, but the foundations are appearing. Wealth, poverty, obligation, dependency, concepts that will eventually shape entire civilizations. All because surplus food exists, which is deeply ironic. Food is supposed to reduce anxiety, yet stored food often creates entirely new forms of anxiety. A family with little food worries about survival. A family with abundant food worries about theft, about protection, about loss, about maintaining what they have. The concerns change. The worrying remains. Perhaps this is one of the most human patterns of all. Solve one problem, create another, then spend generations solving the new one. At night, these worries may have felt especially powerful. Imagine a settlement slowly growing larger. Not a city, not even close. Just larger than before. More shelters, more families, more storage pits, more children, more animals, more activity. The darkness arrives. Fires glow softly. Smoke drifts upward into the night air. People settle into sleep, or attempt to, because sleep becomes more complicated when valuable things exist nearby. A hunter may worry about tomorrow's hunt. A farming family may lie awake listening. Listening for movement, listening for animals, listening for strangers, listening for anything that might threaten the harvest that represents months of effort. Every rustle becomes suspicious. Every bark of a dog demands attention. Every unexpected sound acquires meaning. The grain is sleeping nearby, and so is the anxiety attached to it. It is remarkable how quickly human beings become guardians. Give someone something valuable, and they immediately begin imagining how it might be lost. Perhaps that is when a subtle psychological shift occurs. The world no longer feels quite as open as it once did. Not because the landscape changed, because the mind changed. A person carrying all their possessions can leave. A person protecting a year's worth of food cannot. A person with nothing stored has mobility. A person with abundance has responsibility. And responsibility is heavier than most people expect. Generation after generation, this weight slowly increases. Fields expand, storage expands, families expand, obligations expand. The entire system becomes larger, more productive, more successful, more impressive, and also more fragile. Because now, a single bad season can threaten far more people than before. A single drought, a single flood, a single disease, a single disaster. The stakes keep growing. And the larger the stakes become, the more desperately people search for certainty. Which is exactly why another powerful force is about to enter the story. Not kings, not armies, not governments. Something older, something stranger. The growing belief that perhaps someone, somewhere, knows how to keep the harvest coming. The trouble with uncertainty is that human beings rarely tolerate it for very long. A little uncertainty can be exciting. Too much uncertainty becomes exhausting. And farming, despite all its promises of predictability, never actually removed uncertainty from life. It simply changed its shape. The hunter worried about where food might be found. The farmer worried about whether food would appear at all. The difference may sound small. In reality, it changed everything. Because now entire communities could spend months doing everything correctly and still fail. The seeds could be planted. The fields could be tended. The work could be completed. Every instruction followed. Every lesson remembered. Every effort made. And then a storm arrives at the wrong moment. Or doesn't arrive at all. A season of careful planning can be destroyed by something as simple as a cloud deciding to travel elsewhere. That kind of helplessness leaves a mark on people, especially when children are involved. Especially when hunger is involved. Especially when survival depends upon forces nobody truly understands. And so people began doing what human beings have always done when faced with mysteries. They searched for patterns, not scientific patterns, not yet. Human patterns, meaning explanations, connections, anything that might make the world feel a little less random. Imagine standing at the edge of a field after several weeks without rain. The soil is dry. The plants seem weaker than before. The air feels heavy. Everyone notices. Everyone worries. Everyone watches the horizon. Then one afternoon, rain finally arrives. The crops recover. Relief spreads through the settlement. The danger passes. Now imagine that before the rain arrived, someone had performed a ritual, a song, a prayer, a dance, an offering, something simple, something hopeful. What conclusion might people draw? The answer is obvious. Maybe the ritual worked. Maybe the song helped. Maybe the offering mattered. Maybe somebody out there was listening. Perhaps not every time, but enough times to keep the idea alive. And ideas, once attached to survival, become incredibly difficult to remove. Because agriculture created a new emotional landscape, not merely fields. Expectations, anxiety, waiting, hope, disappointment, relief, fear. Entire emotional cycles tied to weather and harvest. The result was that nature no longer felt like a collection of events. It began feeling personal. If the rains arrived, someone was pleased. If the rains failed, someone was angry. If crops flourished, someone was generous. If crops died, someone had been offended. At least that is how many communities eventually interpreted things. And honestly, it is not difficult to understand why. Imagine trying to explain drought without science. Imagine trying to explain disease without science. Imagine trying to explain why one family's field succeeds while another's fails. Randomness is not emotionally satisfying. Humans prefer stories. Stories provide comfort. Even frightening stories provide more comfort than complete uncertainty. At least a frightening story gives the world structure. A drought caused by angry spirits is terrifying. A drought caused by pure chance is somehow even worse, because chance cannot be negotiated with. Chance cannot be persuaded. Chance cannot be appeased. Chance simply happens. Most people would rather believe there is a reason, any reason. And so, gradually, communities began creating explanations. Not foolish explanations. Not irrational explanations. Reasonable explanations, given the information available. The sky mattered. Rain mattered. Sunlight mattered. Fertility mattered. Harvest mattered. Life depended upon these things. Naturally, they became sacred. Naturally, they became important. Naturally, people began searching for ways to influence them. A prayer costs very little. A ritual costs very little. An offering costs very little. And if there is even a tiny possibility that such actions might help, why not try? After all, people today behave similarly. Athletes wear lucky socks. Students develop examination rituals. Investors follow routines. Travelers carry charms. People knock on wood. Avoid certain numbers. Repeat familiar habits. Human beings have always been surprisingly superstitious whenever outcomes matter. And harvests mattered enormously. A failed hunt is a problem. A failed harvest can become a catastrophe. The scale is different. The consequences are different, which means the emotional pressure is different. Over time, certain individuals begin paying closer attention than others. Perhaps someone becomes known for interpreting weather signs. Perhaps someone remembers seasonal patterns unusually well. Perhaps someone performs ceremonies that communities find reassuring. Perhaps someone simply speaks with confidence during uncertain times. Confidence is an extraordinary resource when everyone else is afraid, especially when nobody actually knows what is going to happen. Imagine a settlement facing a difficult season. People are nervous. The crops are struggling. Children are hungry. Questions fill the air. Then one person stands up and says, "This is what we should do." The advice may be correct. It may be incorrect. That almost doesn't matter. The certainty itself becomes valuable. Human beings often underestimate how comforting confidence can feel during periods of uncertainty. And slowly, very slowly, some people begin occupying special positions within communities, not because they are physically stronger, not because they possess larger fields, because they seem connected to knowledge. Knowledge of seasons, knowledge of rituals, knowledge of ancestors, knowledge of signs, knowledge of things other people fear they do not understand. And once knowledge becomes valuable, influence follows. Again, nobody planned this. Nobody gathered together and decided to invent social hierarchy. The process unfolds naturally. One person becomes trusted. Trust becomes influence. Influence becomes authority. Authority becomes tradition. Tradition becomes power. The pattern repeats endlessly throughout history. What's fascinating is that agriculture created ideal conditions for this process. The more dependent people became upon harvests, the more important explanations became. the more important explanations became, the more valuable certain individuals became. The more valuable those individuals became, the more influence they accumulated. And influence, once acquired, rarely disappears voluntarily. A strange transformation is beginning, not in the fields, inside human relationships. For thousands upon thousands of years, survival had depended heavily upon direct interaction with the natural world. Now another layer is appearing: interpretation, meaning, authority. The people who claim to understand uncertainty gain influence over those who fear it. And fear, unfortunately, is one of humanity's most reliable resources. Fear of drought, fear of starvation, fear of failure, fear of disappointing invisible forces, fear that something important has been forgotten, fear that the next season may not resemble the last one, fear that all this hard work might still not be enough. The irony is almost painful. Agriculture was supposed to make life more predictable, yet in many ways it simply gave people more things to worry about. More investments, more expectations, more responsibilities, more opportunities for disappointment. The fields solved certain problems beautifully, but they also created entirely new categories of anxiety. A person watching wild animals disappear over the horizon may feel uncertainty. A person watching dark clouds form above months of labor feels something far more specific. The field turns weather into personal drama. Every cloud becomes a message. Every wind shift becomes a warning. Every unusual season becomes a source of speculation. And because human beings are storytellers by nature, we begin turning those observations into narratives. Narratives become beliefs. Beliefs become traditions. Traditions become institutions. And institutions, once established, have a remarkable tendency to survive long after people forget why they were created in the first place. A ritual performed because of one drought may still exist hundreds of years later. A custom created during one crisis may survive for generations. A tradition invented as a temporary solution may become permanent. This is another theme that quietly follows humanity throughout history. Temporary solutions often outlive their emergencies. People forget the original problem. The solution remains. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the story of agriculture, because farming itself may have begun as a temporary solution, a useful adaptation, a helpful experiment, something done to reduce uncertainty. Yet generation after generation, people become increasingly tied to it, increasingly dependent upon it, increasingly unable to imagine life without it. Children grow up knowing fields. Grandchildren grow up knowing fields. Entire communities begin assuming that fields are simply part of reality. The old mobile world starts fading from memory, not disappearing completely, just becoming distant, like a story told by grandparents, something familiar, something respected, something increasingly difficult to imagine. And as the old world slowly fades, another reality emerges. Settlements continue growing. Families continue growing. Food production continues growing. Everything seems successful. Everything seems promising. Everything seems to be working, which is precisely why the next problem arrives as such a surprise. Because more food does not simply create more comfort. More food creates more people, and more people create problems nobody has faced before. At first, more people seemed like wonderful news. It is difficult to blame anyone for thinking so. A settlement with more children feels alive. It feels successful. It feels hopeful. Laughter travels farther. More fires glow at night. More hands are available when work needs to be done. More voices fill the air. More stories are told. More futures seem possible. If someone had walked through one of these growing communities, they might have seen only the positive side, a place that appeared healthy, busy, productive, expanding, the sort of place that looked like it had a future. And perhaps that was exactly the problem. For most of human history, population growth had been limited by movement. A mobile life creates natural restrictions. Carrying a small child is difficult. Carrying 2 very young children becomes exhausting. Carrying 3 while moving long distances across unpredictable terrain can become nearly impossible. Nature had quietly imposed boundaries. Not cruel boundaries, practical ones. A family could only move as fast as its slowest member. And very young children are not known for their enthusiasm regarding long-distance travel. But farming changes the equation. A settled life creates different possibilities. A child no longer needs to be carried across vast distances quite so often. Food can be stored. Shelters remain in place. Resources become more predictable. And slowly, almost invisibly, families begin growing larger. One additional child, then another, then another. No dramatic population explosion at first, just a gradual increase. The kind of increase that seems harmless when viewed year by year. But history rarely moves year by year. History moves generation by generation, and generations have a way of multiplying small changes into enormous ones. A grandparent might remember a settlement containing a few dozen people. Their grandchildren might see hundreds. The grandchildren of those grandchildren might struggle to imagine the quieter world that came before. And so the cycle begins. More food supports more people. More people require more food. More food requires more fields. More fields require more labor. More labor makes larger families useful. Larger families produce more people. More people require more food. Round and round the wheel turns. Not because anyone wants it to, because the logic seems irresistible. Each step appears sensible. Each step solves a real problem, yet together they create something unexpected. Dependency. Imagine a farmer looking across a field. A successful harvest promises survival, perhaps even comfort. But it also creates another obligation. The harvest must support more mouths than before. The following year, even more mouths may need feeding. The year after that, even more. Success begins creating its own pressure. A strange situation emerges. The community is becoming better at producing food, yet nobody feels less dependent upon food. If anything, they feel more dependent. The margin for error keeps shrinking. A poor harvest that once affected 20 people now affects 50, then 100, then 200. Every success increases the stakes. Every improvement makes failure more dangerous. And because these changes happen slowly, they are easy to miss. Imagine standing in a growing settlement. You would notice the new children. You would notice the additional shelters. You would notice more activity, more smoke rising from cooking fires, more footprints, more noise, more life. What you might not notice is that flexibility is quietly disappearing. A small group can move. A large settlement cannot. A small community can adapt quickly. A larger one adapts more slowly. The very success of agriculture begins anchoring people to specific places. Roots are spreading, not plant roots, human roots. And roots are wonderful things until circumstances require movement. Then they become chains Not visible chains. Emotional chains. Practical chains. The kind of chains that make leaving feel impossible, because leaving no longer means abandoning a temporary camp. It means abandoning homes, fields, storage pits, tools, memories, relationships, graves, and perhaps nothing binds human beings to a place more powerfully than graves. A curious thing happens once generations begin living in the same location. The dead stay behind. At first, that sounds obvious. Of course they do. But for a highly mobile people, the relationship between the living and the dead is different. Movement changes memory. Settlements change memory too. A child may grow up walking past the resting place of grandparents, parents, ancestors. The landscape becomes filled with personal history. A hill is no longer simply a hill. A river is no longer simply a river. Everything acquires stories. Everything acquires emotional weight. The place itself becomes part of the family, and suddenly leaving is not merely a practical decision. It becomes an emotional one. The settlement begins feeling permanent, even if permanence was never the original plan. Perhaps especially because permanence was never the original plan. History is filled with situations that became permanent accidentally. Humans often arrive somewhere temporarily and discover centuries later that nobody ever left. Meanwhile, the fields continue expanding. More land is cleared. More labor is required. Children who once represented additional joy now represent additional workers. That sounds harsh. It sounds uncomfortable. Because it is. Yet it is also true. Agriculture changed childhood in subtle ways. In a world increasingly organized around labor, every pair of hands became useful. Birds need chasing away from crops. Water needs carrying. Animals need watching. Firewood needs gathering. Seeds need sorting. Food needs processing. Work exists everywhere. A growing child becomes part of the machinery of survival. Not because parents love them less. Quite the opposite. Parents love them enough to ensure they become useful. Useful children survive. Useful families survive. Useful communities survive. Nature is not sentimental, and agriculture often rewards practicality more than sentiment. A difficult reality, but a reality nonetheless. The irony is that many parents probably viewed larger families as security. More children meant more help, more support in old age, more resilience during difficult times. And they were not wrong. The problem is that every family was reaching the same conclusion. When everyone expands simultaneously, the pressure simply moves elsewhere. More mouths, more fields, more labor, more expectations. The system grows. The demands grow. The dependence grows. Sometimes the story of agriculture is described as humanity taking control of nature. But from another angle, it looks remarkably different. From another angle, humanity may have entered into a contract. An unspoken agreement. We provide the labor. The plants provide the calories. We protect the crops. The crops sustain the population. We organize our lives around their needs. They organize their existence around ours. A partnership, but partnerships can become imbalanced, and over time, humans found themselves dedicating astonishing portions of their lives to a handful of domesticated species. Entire civilizations eventually revolved around wheat, or rice, or barley, or millet, or maize. The plants spread, the population spread, the obligations spread. Everything became larger. Except freedom. Freedom, quietly, became smaller, not vanished. Smaller, harder to notice, harder to recover. A hunter waking in the morning might ask, "Where shall we go today?" A farmer increasingly asks, "What must be done today?" The difference sounds subtle. It is not. One question opens possibilities. The other begins with obligation. And obligation, once it becomes the foundation of daily life, has a way of multiplying. Because now the settlement faces a challenge its ancestors rarely encountered on this scale. Not a lack of food, not yet. Not drought, not disease, not war. Those will come later. The next challenge is simpler and perhaps more dangerous. There are now enough people living close together that entirely new problems are beginning to emerge. Problems that nobody planned for. Problems that nobody expected. Problems hiding in the spaces between houses, in the water, in the smoke, in the animals wandering through camp, in the grain stores, in the growing crowd itself. Because the more successful agriculture became, the closer human beings moved toward one another. And as it turns out, nature had been quietly protecting them from something all along. For thousands upon thousands of years, human beings had lived in relatively small groups. Not because they lacked imagination, not because they lacked ambition, because nature quietly encouraged it. Small groups move more easily. They adapt more easily. They spread out across landscapes. And perhaps most importantly, they leave many of their problems behind when they move. A camp becomes messy. People leave. Resources become scarce. People leave. Waste accumulates. People leave. Nature gets an opportunity to recover. The cycle begins again, somewhere else. Simple, not easy, but simple. Agriculture slowly interrupted that cycle. At first, nobody would have noticed. Why would they? The early settlements were still tiny by modern standards. A few shelters, a few families, a few storage pits, a few animals. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would make anyone suspect they were participating in one of the most important biological experiments in human history. Yet that is exactly what they were doing. Because once humans stop moving so frequently, something begins accumulating. Not wealth, not power, not yet. Something much less glamorous. Waste, the least celebrated force in civilization. And yet one of the most important. Nobody enjoys thinking about waste. Most people spend their entire lives trying not to think about it. We build systems specifically designed to make it disappear from view. Pipes, sewers, landfills, treatment facilities. Modern civilization works very hard to hide the evidence of its own existence. 20,000 years ago, none of those systems existed, which meant every success created leftovers. Food scraps, animal remains, broken tools, ash, human waste, animal waste, all the ordinary byproducts of daily life. The kind of things that are manageable when people are constantly moving, far less manageable when they are not. Imagine a settlement growing slowly over several generations. More people arrive. More children are born. More animals are kept nearby. The activity increases. The noise increases. The smells increase. Life becomes busier. And beneath all that activity, invisible changes are taking place. Tiny organisms, tiny parasites, tiny threats that nobody can see. The irony is almost perfect. Agriculture was helping produce more food than ever before. At exactly the same time, it was creating ideal conditions for entirely new health problems. Not because farming was bad, because concentration changes everything. Concentrated food, concentrated people. Concentrated animals. Concentrated waste. Nature notices concentrations. Nature always notices concentrations. If you leave grain in one place, something will eventually discover it. Perhaps insects, perhaps rodents, perhaps both. And grain stores were irresistible. Imagine being a mouse. For countless generations, finding food required constant effort. Then, suddenly, humans create enormous piles of edible material and place them in convenient locations. From a mouse's perspective, civilization was one of the greatest inventions ever created. The relationship between farmers and rodents would become one of history's longest-running conflicts. Quiet, persistent, endless. Every grain store represented opportunity. Every storage pit represented temptation. Every harvest attracted new visitors. And mice rarely arrive alone. Where food accumulates, life accumulates. Some welcome, some not. The people storing grain may have believed they were protecting their future. In many ways, they were, but they were also feeding entire ecosystems. Tiny ecosystems. Invisible ecosystems. Ecosystems that would eventually affect human health in ways nobody could possibly understand. At night, settlements were becoming different places, different from the camps of earlier generations. Listen carefully. A dog barks somewhere in the darkness. A baby begins crying. Someone coughs. A goat shifts nearby. Wood crackles inside a fire. A mouse moves through stored grain. A person turns over in sleep. Another cough follows, then another. The sounds are small, ordinary, unremarkable, yet together they reveal something new. People are living closer together than before, much closer. And proximity changes everything. Today we understand disease through science. Viruses, bacteria, parasites, microscopic organisms. Our ancestors had none of those explanations. What they had were observations. People got sick. Sometimes many people got sick. Sometimes illness seemed to move through communities. Sometimes it arrived unexpectedly. Sometimes it disappeared unexpectedly. Sometimes children recovered. Sometimes they did not, and nobody could fully explain why. That uncertainty was terrifying because random illness feels profoundly unfair. At least a broken bone has a story. You fell, you slipped, you were injured. There is a cause. Disease often arrives without permission, without warning, without explanation. One day, a person is healthy. A few days later, they are not. The mystery itself becomes part of the suffering. Agriculture did not invent disease. Disease is ancient, far older than humanity. But farming created new opportunities for disease to travel, new opportunities to linger, new opportunities to spread. Crowded settlements gave illnesses something they had rarely possessed before: a reliable supply of hosts. The phrase sounds clinical, cold, but the reality was painfully human. A sick child, a worried mother, a fever that refuses to break, a cough echoing through the night. The fear of watching someone become weaker without understanding why. Every civilization that followed would eventually confront the same experience. And many of those experiences began here, in settlements that seemed successful, prosperous, promising. The sort of places people wanted to build. The sort of places people wanted to stay. Success and vulnerability were growing side by side. Another problem was waiting inside the houses themselves, or what passed for houses, because while permanent shelters solved many difficulties, they introduced others. A sturdy shelter protects against wind, protects against rain, protects against cold. Wonderful advantages. But shelters also trap things. Smoke, for example. Most early communities relied heavily on fire. Fire for warmth. Fire for cooking. Fire for light. Fire for protection. Fire was indispensable. The problem was that smoke does not disappear simply because people need the fire. Imagine spending years inside enclosed spaces where smoke drifts slowly through the air, day after day, season after season, year after year. Eyes sting, throats burn, lungs work harder. Nobody understands precisely why. Nobody realizes that survival itself is creating long-term damage. Many of history's greatest costs arrived invisibly, not through dramatic disasters, through repetition. A little smoke every day, a little contamination every day, a little exposure every day. Tiny problems accumulating quietly, much like the settlements themselves. Then there were the animals. Animals changed everything. At first, keeping animals nearby seemed wonderfully practical. A source of food, a source of labor, a source of security, a source of wealth. What could be better? And honestly, it was an extraordinary achievement. One of humanity's greatest accomplishments. Yet once again, every solution carried hidden complications. Animals have their own diseases, their own parasites, their own habits, their own messes, their own unpredictability. They do not politely separate themselves from human life. They become part of it. Their sounds become part of the night. Their smells become part of the settlement. Their problems become part of the community. A child grows up hearing goats, hearing sheep, hearing dogs, perhaps hearing cattle. These sounds become normal, as ordinary as wind, as ordinary as rain, as ordinary as conversation. The closeness feels natural because it is daily, and humans are remarkably adaptable. We can become accustomed to almost anything, even conditions that would seem shocking to outsiders. That adaptability is one of our greatest strengths. It is also one of our greatest vulnerabilities, because people often stop noticing problems that develop gradually. Nobody wakes up one morning and announces, "Our village has become crowded." Crowding happens slowly. Nobody notices the exact day when the air becomes smokier, or the waste becomes more noticeable, or the rodents become more common, or illness becomes slightly more frequent. The changes arrive in tiny increments, small enough to ignore, small enough to normalize, until eventually they become reality. And reality feels ordinary, simply because it has existed for a long time. Perhaps that is one of the deepest ironies in the entire story. The agricultural revolution is often described as humanity escaping nature. Yet in many ways, humanity simply exchanged one set of natural pressures for another. Some old dangers disappeared, new dangers emerged. Predators became less important. Disease became more important. Movement became less common. Crowding became more common. The threats changed shape, but they never vanished. And while families were busy dealing with these new realities, another transformation was unfolding quietly in the background. Not in the fields, not in the houses, not among the animals. Inside the human body itself, because the food that built civilization was beginning to change the people who ate it. One of the strangest things about history is that human bones remember things that human stories forget. A person can live an entire life without leaving behind a single written word. Their name disappears. Their voice disappears. Their dreams disappear. Their fears disappear. Everything that once felt important vanishes. And yet centuries later, a fragment of bone may still be waiting beneath the earth, silent, patient, carrying clues. Not perfect clues. Not complete clues, but clues nonetheless. And when researchers began examining the remains of some of the earliest farming communities, they encountered something unexpected. The story was not entirely what many people had assumed. The traditional version sounded simple. People invent farming. Food becomes more reliable. Life improves. Civilization begins. Everyone benefits. A neat story. A satisfying story. The sort of story humans enjoy telling. Reality, unfortunately, tends to be messier. The first farmers do not always appear healthier than the people who came before them. In some places, they appear shorter. In some places, they show signs of nutritional stress. In some places, their teeth tell surprisingly unpleasant stories. Now imagine for a moment that you are one of these early farmers, not a king, not a leader, not an important figure, just an ordinary person. A person who wakes before sunrise. A person whose life is measured by seasons. A person whose survival depends upon fields. The morning begins early, very early. The work is already waiting. The work is always waiting. That may be one of the defining characteristics of agriculture. The work never feels completely finished. A hunt ends. A journey ends. A gathering expedition ends. A field is different. A field is never entirely satisfied. There is always something else that must be done. Something repaired. Something carried. Something planted. Something harvested. Something stored. Something protected. Something prepared. The tasks blend together until they become the rhythm of life itself. And over years, that rhythm begins shaping the body. Imagine kneeling repeatedly, bending repeatedly, lifting repeatedly, carrying repeatedly, grinding grain repeatedly, day after day, season after season, year after year. Modern people often underestimate the power of repetition. One difficult day is manageable. One difficult month is manageable. A lifetime of repetitive labor is something else entirely. The body adapts, then wears down, adapts again, then wears down again. Many early farming communities depended heavily upon grains: wheat, barley, millet, rice, eventually other crops in other parts of the world. These foods were extraordinarily important. Without them, civilization as we know it never appears. Yet relying heavily upon a small number of staple foods creates its own complications. Imagine eating from a landscape filled with countless possibilities. Wild fruits, roots, nuts, seeds, fish, birds, game animals, seasonal variations, unexpected discoveries. Now imagine gradually narrowing that menu. Not completely, but significantly. More grain, then even more grain, again and again, year after year. A successful harvest produces abundance. But abundance is not always the same thing as variety, and the human body notices variety. The human body notices absence too. Nutrients missing from the diet do not announce themselves dramatically. They arrive quietly. A little weakness, a little fatigue, a little slower growth. Small changes, tiny signals, the sort of signals nobody would necessarily connect to farming, especially because farming appeared successful. The fields were productive. The grain stores were full. The settlement was growing. Everything looked prosperous. And appearances can be wonderfully deceptive. The teeth tell another fascinating story. For countless generations, human beings consumed diets that often required substantial chewing, tough foods, fibrous foods, foods that demanded effort. Agriculture gradually changed that. Grains could be processed, ground, cooked, softened, made easier to consume. That sounds like progress. In many ways, it was. Yet softer foods create unexpected consequences. Food particles linger, starches accumulate, dental problems become increasingly common. A toothache today is miserable. A toothache thousands of years ago could become a nightmare. Imagine pain that follows you everywhere. Pain when eating, pain when speaking, pain when trying to sleep, pain with no dentist, no antibiotics, no modern treatment, only endurance. Human history contains an astonishing amount of endurance. People tolerated discomforts that would send modern individuals directly to emergency clinics. Not because they were stronger, because alternatives did not exist. And so life continued. Fields still required attention. Animals still required care. Food still required processing. Children still required raising. The body could hurt. The work remained. Perhaps nowhere was repetitive labor more obvious than in the preparation of grain itself. Modern people encounter flour in bags. Neat, clean, convenient, almost magical. The transformation from grain to food has already happened long before we arrive. For early farmers, that transformation was work, an extraordinary amount of work. Imagine sitting beside a grinding stone. The motion begins. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Minutes become hours. Hours become days. Days become years. Entire lives pass through repetitive movements. Generation after generation. Hands harden. Shoulders ache. Knees complain. The rhythm becomes so familiar that it almost disappears into the background. The work is always there, like weather, like gravity, like time itself. Children grow up watching it, then eventually performing it. Many of the most important activities in human history are also the least glamorous. Nobody writes epic poems about grain grinding. Nobody builds monuments to carrying water. Nobody creates legends about cleaning storage pits. Yet civilization depended upon such tasks. Entire civilizations. Every city, every kingdom, every empire, every palace, every temple, every monument eventually rests upon countless ordinary people performing repetitive work that history rarely celebrates. There is something strangely humbling about that. The grand achievements of civilization often begin with someone doing something boring, again and again and again. The irony becomes difficult to ignore. Agriculture is frequently described as liberation from uncertainty. Yet for many individuals, it may have meant exchanging one set of hardships for another. Less wandering, more labor, less unpredictability, more obligation, less variety, more routine. And routine is a curious thing. Humans crave it, then complain about it, depend upon it, then dream about escaping it. The first farmers were probably no different. Imagine looking across the landscape. The same fields, the same tasks, the same concerns, the same seasonal cycles, year after year. There is comfort in that familiarity. There is also confinement. A person can feel both simultaneously. In fact, most people do, even today. Perhaps that is why the story of agriculture continues feeling surprisingly modern. The details have changed. The tools have changed. The technology has changed. Yet the underlying experience remains strangely recognizable. Working today to secure tomorrow. Investing effort into uncertain futures. Organizing life around responsibilities that never seem entirely finished. Trusting that all the labor will eventually be worth it. The first farmers would understand that feeling immediately. They lived inside it. Every day, every season, every year. And while their bodies were adapting to this new way of life, another transformation was quietly unfolding around them. A transformation even larger than fields, larger than villages, larger than harvests. Because once some families began producing more than they immediately needed, surplus entered the story. And surplus has a habit of changing everything it touches. Surplus is one of those words that sounds harmless, almost boring. The sort of word that belongs in accounting records or economic reports. Not the sort of word that changes the course of human history. And yet surplus may be one of the most powerful forces our species has ever encountered. Because surplus is not simply extra food. Surplus is stored possibility. It is tomorrow sitting quietly in front of you. It is choice. It is leverage. It is influence. It is power that has not yet decided what shape it wants to take. For most of human existence, producing enough food was already an achievement. Anything beyond that was uncertain. Nature gave generously some seasons, and less generously in others. Life existed close to the edge. Not always on the edge, but close enough to see it. Agriculture slowly changed that relationship. A good harvest might produce more than a family immediately required. At first, this seems wonderful. And it was wonderful. A reserve against bad weather, protection against uncertainty, a buffer against hunger. The problem is that surplus rarely remains just surplus. Humans begin finding uses for it. Then more uses. Then even more uses. A basket of grain stored for safety becomes a basket of grain available for exchange. Exchange becomes trade. Trade becomes opportunity. Opportunity becomes advantage. Advantage becomes inequality. Not instantly, not dramatically, slowly, as always. History prefers gradual transformations. Imagine two neighboring families. One harvest is particularly successful. The grain stores are full, perhaps fuller than expected. For the first time, there is more food than can be immediately consumed. An unusual situation. A new situation. A powerful situation. The family now possesses something rare. Options. Options are surprisingly important. A family struggling to survive has very few. A family with reserves has many. Perhaps they exchange grain for tools. Perhaps they exchange grain for labor. Perhaps they exchange grain for favors. Perhaps they exchange grain for future promises. Every possibility creates another relationship. And relationships, once established, tend to grow. The fascinating thing about surplus is that it allows certain people to stop doing some of the work that everybody else must do. For thousands of years, nearly everyone had been directly involved in obtaining food. It was difficult to avoid. Food demanded attention. Food demanded effort. Food demanded participation. But once enough surplus exists, something unusual becomes possible. Not everyone has to spend all of their time producing food. One person can spend more time making tools. Another can spend more time building. Another can focus on rituals. Another can organize. Another can trade. Another can become exceptionally skilled at something unrelated to farming. At first, this sounds entirely positive, and in many ways it is. Specialization is one of civilization's great strengths. It allows knowledge to deepen, skills to improve, technologies to develop, communities to become more complex. The world becomes richer, more capable, more sophisticated. But complexity always arrives carrying baggage. Because once some people are producing food and others are not, new questions emerge. Important questions, uncomfortable questions. Who decides who receives the surplus? Who decides whose work matters? Who decides whose contribution is valuable? The answers are rarely simple. Imagine a person who spends their days making tools. Their work is useful. Everyone agrees. The community benefits. Food producers support them. Reasonable. Now imagine another person who coordinates storage, tracks harvests, organizes labor, resolves disputes. Again, useful. Again, valuable. Again, supported by surplus. The system appears logical, but over time, subtle differences begin emerging. Some people gain access to information others do not possess. Some gain influence. Some gain authority. Some gain prestige. And prestige is an interesting thing. Unlike grain, prestige does not spoil. Unlike grain, prestige can accumulate almost indefinitely. A respected individual becomes more respected. An influential individual becomes more influential. A trusted individual becomes more trusted. The process feeds itself. Eventually, certain families begin acquiring advantages that have little to do with harvest quality. Their position itself becomes valuable. Their relationships become valuable. Their reputation becomes valuable. Their influence becomes valuable. The surplus is no longer merely feeding people. It is feeding systems. Systems that grow larger with each generation. Systems that become increasingly difficult to untangle. One generation inherits land. The next generation inherits land and status. The next inherits land, status, and influence. The next inherits expectations. By this point, nobody remembers where the process began, because human beings have a tendency to mistake old arrangements for natural laws. If something exists long enough, people begin assuming it was always there. This happens constantly. A child born into a world of inequality rarely experiences it as a new development. It simply appears normal. The world seems naturally arranged that way. Some families have more. Some families have less. Some people give instructions. Others follow them. The pattern feels permanent, but permanence is often just history that has been forgotten. The first signs were probably subtle. One family possesses slightly larger storage areas. Another owns slightly more animals. Another controls access to a valuable resource. Nothing dramatic, nothing shocking, just tiny differences. The sort of differences most people barely notice until they become impossible to ignore. And while some families were accumulating advantages, something equally important was happening elsewhere. The settlements themselves were changing. A larger population creates different needs. More food must move. More disputes must be settled. More resources must be managed. More decisions must be made. Complexity begins increasing faster than anyone expected. A small village can rely on familiarity. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone remembers. Everyone participates. But what happens when the village becomes larger? What happens when there are too many people for personal memory to keep track of everything? New systems emerge. They have to. Human beings create systems whenever reality becomes too complicated to manage informally. Rules appear. Traditions become formalized. Responsibilities become defined. Expectations become clearer. The settlement begins organizing itself, not because anyone is trying to create a government, because confusion is inefficient, and humans dislike inefficiency almost as much as uncertainty. The irony, of course, is that every new system solves one problem while creating another. A rule reduces confusion, then limits flexibility. An authority resolves disputes, then accumulates power. An organization improves coordination, then creates hierarchy. Again and again, the same pattern appears. Civilization advances through solutions, then spends centuries managing the consequences of those solutions. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue living ordinary lives. That is another truth history often hides. Most people are not thinking about civilization. Most people are thinking about dinner, about children, about weather, about work, about relationships, about whether the harvest will be good, about whether the roof will survive another season. The grand story unfolds around them while they focus on immediate concerns. And perhaps that is why history changes so effectively. Nobody experiences it as history. They experience it as daily life. One generation stores grain. The next generation expands fields. The next generation inherits obligations. The next generation inherits rules. The next generation inherits authority structures. The next generation inherits inequality. And eventually, what began as a practical strategy for obtaining food becomes an entire way of organizing human existence. A remarkable achievement. A dangerous achievement. A successful achievement. Perhaps all three at once. Because the same surplus that allows specialists, builders, traders, organizers, and leaders to emerge also creates something entirely new, something humanity has never encountered on this scale before. The ability to gather hundreds, then thousands, then eventually tens of thousands of people into the same place. And once that becomes possible, villages begin transforming into something else, something larger, something stranger, something that future generations will eventually call a city. For most of human history, it was possible to know almost everyone around you, not just recognize them, know their parents, know their children, know their habits, know their strengths, know their weaknesses, know the stories people told about them when they were not present. Human life existed on a scale the human brain understood instinctively, a scale shaped over countless generations, a few families, a familiar landscape, a manageable number of relationships. And then, slowly, something changed. Not overnight. Nothing in this story happens overnight. The settlements kept growing. A few more houses, a few more families, a few more storage buildings, a few more animals, a few more children. Every addition seemed harmless, reasonable, expected. After all, growth was a sign of success. Why would anyone fear success? If food was abundant, more people survived. If more people survived, communities expanded. If communities expanded, opportunities expanded. The logic was difficult to argue with, and so the settlements continued growing. Until one day, without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, people began encountering strangers inside their own communities. That was new, very new. For thousands of years, strangers usually came from somewhere else. Now strangers might live only a short walk away. People you recognized but did not truly know. People whose families you could not easily place. People whose histories were unfamiliar. People who occupied the same settlement yet existed outside your immediate circle. It sounds ordinary to us. Modern life is built upon such experiences. We share cities with millions of people we will never know. We pass strangers every day without a second thought. But imagine how strange that would have felt to someone whose ancestors lived almost entirely within networks of personal familiarity. The psychological landscape was changing. Not just the physical one. A larger settlement creates different emotions, different concerns, different forms of trust. Trust itself becomes more complicated. In a small community, trust often grows naturally. People observe one another continuously. Reputation travels quickly. Actions have visible consequences. In larger communities, information becomes imperfect, incomplete, uncertain. People begin relying on systems rather than personal knowledge, rules instead of familiarity, procedures instead of relationships, structures instead of memories. And while these developments solve real problems, they introduce a subtle feeling that many people still recognize today. The feeling of being surrounded by people while somehow feeling less connected to them. The first cities were not simply larger villages, they were new psychological environments, new ways of experiencing human life. Imagine walking through one of these growing settlements. The sounds are different now. More conversations, more animals, more tools striking stone, more children running through narrow pathways, more activity everywhere. The settlement feels alive, busy, energetic, successful, and also slightly overwhelming. Human beings evolved in environments where silence was common, distance was common, solitude was common. Now activity surrounds them constantly. The world feels denser, more crowded, more demanding. There is always something happening, always someone nearby, always another responsibility waiting. And responsibilities continue multiplying. Because larger communities require coordination, a surprising amount of coordination. Who maintains shared resources? Who settles disagreements? Who organizes labor when major projects are necessary? Who decides where new structures can be built? Who manages access to water? Who protects food reserves? The questions never stop, and every answer creates another layer of organization. At first, these arrangements may feel temporary. Most systems begin that way. Someone steps forward during a problem. People appreciate the help. The solution works. The role continues. Then it expands. Then it becomes normal. Then eventually, nobody remembers life before it existed. History has a remarkable talent for turning temporary arrangements into permanent realities. Perhaps a respected individual begins coordinating harvest storage, a useful responsibility, nothing more. A generation later, the position still exists. Another generation passes. The role becomes expected. Another passes. The role becomes necessary. Soon people cannot imagine the community functioning without it. The same pattern appears everywhere. Not because humans plan centuries ahead, because practical solutions accumulate layer upon layer, like sediment gathering at the bottom of a river. The result is civilization, not a single invention, not a single decision. 1,000 practical choices stacked on top of one another until they become something entirely new. And yet, beneath all this growth, all this complexity, all this apparent progress, an uncomfortable question remains quietly waiting. Are people actually happier? The question sounds simple. It is not. Because happiness is notoriously difficult to measure. A successful farmer may possess more food than a hunter. Does that make life better? Perhaps, perhaps not. A settled family may experience greater stability. Does that make life better? Perhaps, perhaps not. A growing community may provide more security. Does that make life better? Again, perhaps, perhaps not. Human beings have always been surprisingly complicated about such things. We often gain something and lose something simultaneously, then spend generations arguing about whether the exchange was worthwhile. Agriculture may be the greatest example of this pattern. People gained food security and lost mobility, gained larger communities and lost certain forms of independence, gained predictability, and gained new anxieties, gained civilization, and inherited obligations. The balance sheet becomes difficult to read. Imagine an elderly person sitting near the edge of a settlement. Perhaps they remember a different world. Not completely different, just different enough. A world with more movement, more open land, fewer people, fewer rules, fewer responsibilities, fewer storage buildings, fewer arguments about ownership. Perhaps they look at the growing settlement and feel pride or concern, or both. Human beings often feel both when witnessing change. Progress rarely arrives without nostalgia following close behind. The younger generation sees opportunity. The older generation remembers alternatives. Neither is entirely wrong. That may be one reason the story of agriculture remains so fascinating. There is no simple villain, no obvious mistake, no single moment where humanity takes a wrong turn. Instead, there are trade-offs. Thousands of trade-offs, each one understandable, each one reasonable, each one leading toward consequences nobody fully anticipated. The city itself becomes a symbol of those trade-offs, a place of extraordinary possibility, a place where specialists gather, knowledge accumulates, ideas spread, trade flourishes, technology advances, culture expands, art appears, architecture grows more ambitious. Everything begins accelerating, and acceleration feels exciting. It always does. But acceleration also makes stopping difficult. A person can leave a camp. A community can abandon a village. A civilization cannot easily abandon a city. The investments are too large. The population is too large. The dependence is too deep. The machine keeps moving, because by now agriculture is no longer simply producing food. It is producing momentum. And momentum may be the most powerful force in the entire story. Generation after generation, the system grows larger. More fields, more people, more buildings, more authority, more specialization, more complexity. Everything expanding together. Everything becoming interconnected. Everything becoming dependent upon everything else. And as the web grows denser, another truth becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The system is creating incredible achievements. Achievements beyond anything earlier humans could have imagined. Yet it is also making people work harder than ever to keep it running. The fields still need tending. The grain still needs storing. The animals still need feeding. The structures still need maintenance. The systems still need management. The population still needs supporting. Civilization is becoming magnificent. Civilization is also becoming hungry, very hungry. Because the more successful it becomes, the more it demands. And perhaps that is the strangest twist in the entire story. The invention that was supposed to solve the problem of survival never actually finished the job. Instead, it created a world where survival became everyone's permanent occupation. There is a peculiar moment that appears again and again throughout human history. A moment so common that most people never notice it while it is happening. Someone creates a tool to save time, then spends the saved time maintaining the tool. Someone invents a system to simplify life, then spends years managing the system. Someone solves a problem, then inherits 10 new problems from the solution. The pattern is almost comical, and agriculture may be the largest example our species has ever produced. Because if you step back far enough, the entire story begins to look strangely circular. People wanted greater security, so they planted. Planting required staying in one place. Staying in one place encouraged larger families. Larger families required more food. More food required larger fields. Larger fields required more labor. More labor required more organization. More organization required more authority. More authority required more systems. More systems required more maintenance. And eventually, an enormous portion of human life became dedicated to sustaining the very structure that had been created to make life easier. Nobody intended this. That is what makes it so fascinating. History often resembles a conversation nobody planned to have. One generation solves a problem. The next generation inherits the solution, then discovers the solution has become a problem. So they create another solution, which becomes another problem. And onward the story goes. Imagine walking through a settlement that has now grown into something approaching a small city. The fields stretch outward in every direction. Storage buildings stand full of grain. Animals move through designated areas. Workers carry supplies. Families prepare meals. Children chase one another through narrow paths. Everything appears successful, busy, productive, alive. Yet beneath that success lies a simple reality. Tomorrow, everyone must wake up and do it again. The fields do not remain planted forever. The grain does not harvest itself. The roofs do not repair themselves. The irrigation channels do not maintain themselves. The animals do not care that people are tired. The system never truly rests. In some ways, agriculture solved the problem of uncertainty by replacing it with obligation. And obligation has a unique quality. It follows you. A hunter may finish a hunt. A traveler may complete a journey. A farmer rarely feels entirely finished. There is always another season approaching. Always another preparation to make. Always another responsibility waiting patiently in the future. The future becomes crowded. Crowded with tasks. Crowded with expectations. Crowded with obligations. And the remarkable thing is that people adapt to this. Human beings adapt to almost everything. A child born into a farming community does not experience agriculture as a burden imposed upon them. They experience it as normal life. The same way modern people rarely question alarm clocks, work schedules, bills, appointments, deadlines. Most systems feel natural to the people raised inside them. That may be one of history's greatest illusions. Normal is often just something that has existed long enough. Imagine explaining modern office work to a hunter-gatherer. The conversation would be difficult. You wake up at a specific hour every day. You travel to the same building. You spend most of the day performing specialized tasks. You repeat this process for decades. And in exchange, you receive pieces of paper or numbers that can later be exchanged for food. The hunter-gatherer might stare at you for a very long time, not because the system is foolish, because it would feel unfamiliar. The same thing happened with agriculture. The first generations likely experienced the changes directly. The later generations inherited them as reality, and inherited realities are rarely questioned. This is how civilizations become stable. It is also how civilizations become trapped. The trap is not physical. Nobody is forcing people to stay. The trap is dependency. By now, entire populations depend upon harvests. Entire populations depend upon storage. Entire populations depend upon fields. Entire populations depend upon social systems built around those fields. Leaving becomes increasingly difficult because there is so much to leave behind. Homes, land, relationships, obligations, infrastructure, expectations. The web grows denser every generation, and the denser the web becomes, the harder it is to imagine alternatives. Perhaps this is the moment where the idea of agriculture as a mistake becomes most tempting. Not because agriculture failed, quite the opposite. Because it succeeded so thoroughly, a failed experiment disappears. A successful experiment reshapes the world. Agriculture reshaped everything: the environment, the economy, the family, the body, the village, the city, the relationship between humans and nature, the relationship between humans and one another, the relationship between the present and the future. Nothing remained untouched. That level of success comes with consequences. Some wonderful, some uncomfortable, many impossible to separate from one another. Consider a simple example. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus allowed specialization. Specialization allowed innovation. Innovation eventually produced medicine. Modern medicine saves millions of lives. Wonderful. Yet agriculture also helped create dense populations where disease could spread more easily in the first place. Which side belongs on the balance sheet? The answer is both. That is the frustrating beauty of history. Most developments are neither entirely good nor entirely bad. They are complicated, messy, human. Agriculture gave people opportunities that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. It also imposed burdens those earlier generations never experienced. The same system that allowed cities to rise also required countless people to spend their lives performing repetitive labor. The same system that created great monuments also created inequality. The same system that produced abundance also produced scarcity whenever it failed. The same system that expanded knowledge also expanded bureaucracy. The same system that increased security also increased dependence. Every gift arrived carrying a shadow. Every shadow arrived attached to a gift. Perhaps that is why the debate never ends. Even today, thousands of years later, people still argue, was agriculture humanity's greatest achievement or humanity's greatest mistake? The question itself may be flawed because it assumes history behaves like a decision, as if someone stood at a crossroads and chose one path over another. Reality was far stranger. Agriculture emerged gradually, piece by piece, region by region, generation by generation. Nobody voted on it. Nobody approved it. Nobody fully understood where it would lead. People simply responded to circumstances, adapted, experimented, improvised. The future emerged from those improvisations, just as it usually does. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the entire story. The people who changed the world were not trying to change the world. They were trying to survive the next season. The parent storing grain was not creating civilization. The farmer planting seeds was not inventing empires. The worker digging irrigation channels was not building future nations. Yet all of them were participating in something larger than themselves, a transformation nobody could fully see while living through it. Which raises a question worth lingering on for a moment. If the first farmers could somehow see the world today, the cities, the highways, the airplanes, the satellites, the internet, the billions of people, the endless fields visible from space, would they consider it a success? Would they feel pride? Would they feel astonishment? Would they feel regret? Or would they simply stare at the modern world and wonder why so many people still seem busy trying to secure tomorrow? Because, in a strange way, the story never ended. We are still living inside it. The fields became companies. The granaries became banks. The storage systems became databases. The settlements became megacities. The obligations changed shape, but obligations remain. The future is still being managed, still being calculated, still being protected, still being worried about. The same anxiety that once sat beside a pile of grain now sits inside retirement accounts, investment portfolios, insurance systems, supply chains, and digital records. The technology changed. The instinct remained. And maybe that instinct began long ago, when human beings first discovered that storing food could make tomorrow feel a little safer. A little safer, but never completely safe. Because complete safety has always remained just beyond reach. Perhaps that is why agriculture never truly solved uncertainty. It simply taught humanity how to organize itself around it. So, was it a mistake? It is tempting to answer quickly. Human beings enjoy clear answers. We enjoy villains, heroes, victories, failures. Simple conclusions neatly wrapped at the end of complicated stories. History rarely cooperates, especially this story, because the deeper you look, the harder the question becomes. Imagine standing beside one of those first cultivated fields, not as a modern observer, not as a historian, not as someone who already knows what comes next, just as an ordinary person. The field represents food, security, possibility, the chance that children might survive a difficult winter, the chance that next year might be slightly easier than the last. Would you reject it? Probably not. Most people wouldn't. And that is an important detail. The agricultural revolution did not spread because people were foolish. It spread because it worked. Not perfectly, not without costs, but it worked well enough. Well enough that communities continued doing it. Well enough that populations expanded. Well enough that the idea kept returning whenever conditions favored it. A truly terrible idea rarely survives for thousands of years. Agriculture survived because it solved real problems. The difficulty is that solving one problem often creates another. Imagine a world without farming. No cities, no kingdoms, no empires, no writing, no libraries, no universities, no modern medicine, no large-scale science, no industrial technology, no internet, no videos like the one you're listening to right now. The chain stretches backward, farther than most people realize. Pull one link away, and countless others disappear with it. That alone makes the story difficult, because many of the things people value most emerged from the same process that created many of the problems they dislike most. Agriculture helped create inequality. It also helped create art. It helped create hierarchy. It also helped create knowledge. It helped create warfare on larger scales. It also helped create extraordinary cooperation. It helped create exploitation. It also helped create civilization itself. How do you separate those things? Perhaps you cannot. Perhaps they were always tangled together, like roots beneath the soil. Pull on one, and many others move with it. That may be why historians continue arguing, not because the evidence is unclear, because the evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously. The first farmers may have worked harder than some of the hunter-gatherers who came before them, yet their descendants eventually built cities. Those cities eventually produced innovations. Those innovations transformed the world. Was the trade worthwhile? The answer depends entirely on where you stand. Ask a person suffering through endless agricultural labor. The answer might be different. Ask a parent whose stored grain saves a child during a difficult winter. The answer might be different. Ask a ruler living comfortably from agricultural surplus. The answer might be different. Ask a laborer building monuments under the authority of that ruler. The answer might be very different indeed. History rarely delivers a single verdict. It delivers perspectives. And perspectives multiply with every generation. Perhaps the more interesting question is not whether agriculture was a mistake. Perhaps the more interesting question is why humans accepted its costs. Why endure the labor? Why tolerate the uncertainty? Why continue expanding the system? Why keep building upon it, generation after generation? Part of the answer may be surprisingly simple, because every generation inherits a world rather than choosing one. A child born into a farming village does not compare farming to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They compare this harvest to last harvest, this season to last season, this year to last year. Human beings evaluate life from where they stand, not from every possible alternative. The people living inside agricultural societies were not constantly debating whether to abandon civilization. They were trying to solve immediate problems: repairing roofs, raising children, protecting crops, managing disputes, living ordinary lives. The same thing we do today. Most people are not trying to reshape history. Most people are trying to make it through the week. History moves anyway. That may be one of the most fascinating lessons hidden inside this entire story. The world is often transformed by people pursuing ordinary goals, not grand ambitions, not revolutionary visions, ordinary goals: safety, food, comfort, security, family, the desire for a slightly better future. Those motivations built everything: the first field, the first village, the first city, the first state, the modern world. Everything grew from those simple desires. And perhaps that realization should make us pause for a moment. Because if ordinary decisions created this world, what kinds of worlds are our ordinary decisions creating now? The people who planted the first fields could not see 10,000 years into the future. Neither can we. They believed they were solving immediate problems. We believe exactly the same thing. Maybe future generations will look back at some of our own systems with the same mixture of admiration and confusion. Perhaps they will wonder why we organized life the way we did, why we accepted certain trade-offs, why we spent so much time pursuing certain goals, why we tolerated certain costs. History has a habit of making every generation look strange eventually, and perhaps that is comforting, because it reminds us that uncertainty is not a flaw in the human story. It is the human story. The first farmers did not know where the path would lead. They walked it anyway. The first builders of cities did not know what cities would become. They built them anyway. The first people storing grain could not imagine global civilization, yet somehow they helped create it, one season at a time, one harvest at a time, one practical decision at a time. And that brings us back to the tiny seed where this story began. Such a small thing, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. A tiny package of potential, a tiny package of uncertainty, a tiny package of hope. Perhaps that is the perfect symbol for humanity itself. We plant, we plan, we worry, we prepare. We imagine futures that do not yet exist. Sometimes our plans succeed, sometimes they fail. Most often they do a little of both. The agricultural revolution may not have been humanity's greatest mistake, and it may not have been humanity's greatest achievement. It may have been something far more interesting. A bargain made gradually, a bargain between freedom and security, between mobility and stability, between uncertainty and obligation. A bargain nobody fully understood while making it. A bargain whose consequences are still unfolding all around us, even now. And as you listen to this, surrounded by inventions, systems, and comforts built upon thousands of years of accumulated surplus, it is worth remembering just how much of our world began with people simply trying to make sure they had enough to eat next season. No grand master plan, no blueprint for civilization, just ordinary humans doing what humans have always done, trying to make tomorrow a little less uncertain than today. And perhaps that is why the story feels so familiar, because despite everything that has changed, we are still doing exactly the same thing.